The old veteran's hands trembled as he tried to navigate his walker across the gas station parking lot, his silver star pin barely visible on his faded cap. "Hey, Grandpa, you're blocking the pumps," one of the leather-clad bikers shouted, his friends erupting in laughter as they revved their engines and circled the elderly man like predators toying with wounded prey. No one stepped forward to help, as the veteran's eyes, once sharp enough to spot enemy movement from half a mile away in the jungles of Vietnam, now filled with quiet humiliation. The station attendant looked away, pretending to be busy with law. Inventory. A woman in her car locked her doors. Even the security camera seemed to turn a blind eye to what was happening. But then the rumble of an approaching vehicle cut through the air, and a black SUV with government plates pulled in silently behind the motorcycles, its tinted windows revealing nothing of who might be inside. What connection did these mysterious arrivals have to the man these bikers had chosen to torment? Harold Winters kept his eyes fixed on the ground, focusing on the next step rather than the jeers surrounding him. At 73, he had endured far worse than a group of leather-clad bikers with more attitude than sense. His weathered hands gripped the walker's aluminum frame tighter, the same hands that once field-stripped an M16 in complete darkness, now struggling with the simple task of mobility. "Need a wheelchair, old man?" Another biker called out, his beard split by a cruel grin. Or maybe diapers? The laughter cut through the air like shrapnel, but Harold's expression remained unchanged. 30 years as a Marine had taught him something these men would never understand. True strength wasn't about intimidation, but endurance. In his mind, Harold was back at Paris Island, a drill instructor's voice echoing in his ears. A Marine's dignity isn't given by others, Winters. It's maintained from within. Those words had carried him through firefights, prison camps, and now, this small-town humiliation. The gas station just off Route 16 in Millfield was Harold's monthly pilgrimage. His pension arrived like clockwork on the 15th, and he made his solitary journey from his cabin 3 miles outside town to get his medications, minimal groceries, and the gasoline that powered his small generator. Independence was all he had left. A woman exited the convenience store, glancing at the scene before hurriedly entering her sedan. Harold caught her eye momentarily, the flash of sympathy quickly overcome by self-preservation. He didn't blame her. Most people instinctively avoided confrontation, a luxury he'd never been afforded during his years of service. "Sir?" The gas station attendant had finally emerged, a lanky teenager with anxious eyes. "Do you need help?" Before Harold could respond, the lead biker stepped between them, his substantial frame casting a shadow. "Mind your business, kid. We're just having a conversation with our elderly friend here." Harold recognized the calculated intimidation, the casual hand resting near a concealed blade, the stance designed to project dominance, amateur tactics compared to what he'd witnessed in war. "I'm fine, son," Harold said to the attendant, his voice steady despite the tremor in his limbs. "Just getting my medicine today." The boy retreated, conflict averted, but shame evident in his hurried steps back to the safety of the store. Harold couldn't fault him either. The world had changed. People minded their own business now. Community had become an antiquated concept. One of the bikers kicked the walker's wheel, not hard enough to topple it, but sufficient to communicate threat. "Veterans discount doesn't apply to blocking the whole damn station, Pops." Harold allowed himself one deep breath the way his therapist at the VA had taught him. The oxygen centered him, pushing back the familiar darkness that sometimes clouded his thoughts when threatened. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He wouldn't become the angry, broken veteran they clearly expected. The rumble of the approaching black SUV registered in Harold's awareness before the bikers noticed it. Military instincts never truly faded. He'd cataloged the sound of the engine, noted its deceleration pattern, recognized the deliberate way it positioned, itself blocking the exit route, tactical approach. Government vehicle, professionals. Harold kept his eyes down, but his posture shifted imperceptibly. 30 years of combat experience telegraphed a clear message to anyone trained to see it. I am aware. I am ready. The bikers continued their taunting, oblivious to the black vehicle now idling behind their motorcycles, its tinted windows revealing nothing of the occupants. The SUV's engine cut off with military precision. No excessive idling, no wasted movement. One biker finally noticed, nudging his companion. "Looks like we've got company, boys." Harold remained still, his weathered face impassive as the first. Car door opened. Years of discipline kept his curiosity contained, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The air now carried the unmistakable weight of consequence. The first man who emerged from the SUV wore a charcoal suit that couldn't quite disguise the military bearing beneath it. Around 50, with salt and pepper hair cropped close to the scalp and eyes that methodically scanned the environment. Harold recognized the assessment immediately. Threat detection, exit routes, tactical positioning. This was no ordinary government bureaucrat. 2 more men exited the vehicle in coordinated succession. One was younger, maybe mid-30s, with the lean physique of someone who ran daily, regardless of weather. The third was older, distinguished-looking, with a bearing that suggested authority. All 3 wore identical dark suits with American flag pins on their lapels. "Check out the men in black," one of the bikers snickered, but his voice lacked conviction. Something about these newcomers had changed the atmosphere at the gas station. The lead biker, Crash, according to the patch on his leather vest, maintained his aggressive posture, but Harold noticed his weight shift slightly. Posturing was easy when intimidating an elderly veteran and a teenage attendant. These new arrivals complicated matters. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" The oldest of the suited men spoke, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone. Accustomed to diffusing situations, Crash crossed his tattooed arms across his chest. "Just having a friendly conversation with the old-timer here. Nothing that concerns you government types." The second suited man had positioned himself at the edge of the group, effectively cutting off the most obvious escape route for the bikers. It was a subtle maneuver that would go unnoticed by civilians, but spoke volumes to Harold. These men had tactical training. "Actually," the first man said, "we've been looking for Mr. Winters all morning." He turned to Harold, a flash of recognition in his eyes. "Harold Winters, correct? Former gunnery sergeant, 1st Marine Division?" Harold's gaze lifted fully for the first time, studying the man's face. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but the decades had a way of blurring memories. "That's right," he confirmed, his voice stronger than it had been moments before. The third suited man approached, maintaining a respectful distance. "Sir, I'm Special Agent Thomas Kearney with the Department of Defense. These are my colleagues, Agent Richardson and Major Collins." He gestured to the younger man and the salt and pepper-haired man in turn. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't the afternoon entertainment they'd anticipated. "Department of Defense?" Harold echoed, a mixture of confusion and wariness in his tone. The government had largely forgotten about him decades ago, aside from his modest pension and the occasionally useful but mostly frustrating VA health care. Major Collins stepped forward, his posture shifting subtly. Harold recognized the stance immediately, one military man addressing another. "Gunny Winters, we've been authorized to discuss some matters of national security that have recently been declassified. Is there somewhere more private we could speak?" The teenage attendant had reappeared at the doorway of the convenience store, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Others had begun to notice as well. A truck driver filling up at the diesel pump. An elderly couple who'd pulled in for a bathroom break. Small-town curiosity was piqued. Crash, sensing his audience and influence diminishing, made one last attempt to salvage his pride. "Hey, we weren't finished talking to the old man." Major Collins didn't even turn to acknowledge him. "I believe." "You were, sir. Mr. Winters has an appointment with us now." The disciplined dismissal left no room for argument. Harold noticed the major's hand hadn't moved toward any weapon, but his posture communicated absolute certainty that he would prevail in any confrontation. The youngest agent, Richardson, had quietly circled to the other side of the bikers' motorcycles. His position wasn't threatening, but it was strategically sound. These men operated as a unit, communicating without words in a language Harold understood intimately. "Gunny Winters," Major Collins said, using the respectful shorthand for Harold's former rank, "would you be willing to accompany us? What we need to discuss has been a long time coming." Harold's mind raced through possibilities. In his experience, the government rarely sought out aging veterans for positive reasons. Usually, it meant benefits were being cut or some bureaucratic error needed correction. But something in the major's tone suggested this was different. "What's this about?" Harold asked, military directness overriding his usual reticence. "Operation Stillwater, sir," Collins replied quietly. "May 12, 1971. Harold's knuckles whitened on his walker. That name, that date, words and numbers he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 50 years. Earlier that morning, Harold had woken before dawn, same as he had every day for the past 53 years. Military habits died hard, if they died at all. He sat on the edge of his bed, taking inventory of the day's pain levels. Left knee, worse than yesterday. Lower back, same persistent throb. Right shoulder, bearable. The ritual was as familiar as the face that greeted him in the bathroom mirror, lined, weathered, belonging to a stranger who had somehow replaced the young Marine he still expected to see. The small cabin creaked around him as he moved through his morning routine with methodical precision. Coffee first, strong and black, the way he'd learned to drink it in the jungle when the luxury of cream and sugar was unimaginable. He'd long ago lost the taste for anything sweeter. Harold's calendar hung by the kitchen table, most days unmarked, except for his VA appointments and the occasional reminder to pay a bill. But today's date, May 12th, had been circled in red every year since 1971. No written explanation accompanied the marking. None was needed. "Morning, boys," Harold murmured to the framed photograph on his mantel. 5 young men in jungle. Fatigues, arms slung over each other's shoulders, faces bearing the complex mixture of bravado and terror that defined their generation at war. He was the only one still standing. His medication sat lined up on the kitchen counter. The anti-inflammatory for his joints, the blood pressure pills, the ones that were supposed to help with the nightmares, but rarely did. Harold counted them carefully, noting he'd need refills soon. Hence today's journey into town. The television remained off. Harold had little use for the noise and drama of modern media. His radio, tuned to the classical station from the city 60 miles away, provided all the company he needed. Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 filled the small space as Harold eased himself into his worn armchair, the day's first cup of coffee warming his gnarled hands. From this window, he could see the narrow dirt road that connected his property to civilization, winding through pine trees until it disappeared around a bend. Rarely did anyone travel it except Harold himself and the occasional delivery driver braving the route to bring supplies. His nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away, a distance Harold had specifically sought when purchasing this land with his modest savings and VA loan 15 years ago. After Vietnam, crowds had become impossible. Too many bodies, too many unpredictable movements, too many potential threats his combat-trained mind couldn't stop assessing. Harold finished his coffee and began preparing for town. The process took longer these days. His uniform, because he still thought of his clothing choices that way, was simple: pressed khaki pants, a button-down shirt free of wrinkles, and a navy blue cap that bore no military insignia. Harold kept his service to himself. No veteran's license plate, no Marine Corps bumper stickers. His war was his own business. The medals stayed in their box beneath his bed, all except the small silver star pin he allowed himself on certain days. Today qualified. The walk to his old pickup truck took twice as long with the walker. His doctor had recommended it after Harold's second fall last winter, and despite his initial resistance, pragmatism eventually won out. A broken hip would mean the end of his independence, and that was unacceptable. The ancient Ford protested briefly before the engine caught. Harold had maintained it meticulously, another habit from his military days. Equipment failure in the field meant death. Here it merely meant inconvenience, but the principle remained the same. As he navigated the bumpy access road, Harold mentally reviewed his tasks for the day. Medications first, then groceries, coffee, canned goods, the protein supplements. His doctor insisted would help maintain what remained of his muscle mass. Maybe he'd treat himself to a proper meal at the diner, though the thought of eating alone among families and chattering teenagers held little appeal. The anniversary always brought darker thoughts closer to the surface. May 12, 1971, the day that had earned him the Silver Star he now wore. The day 3 of the men in that photograph had died. The day Harold Winters had failed his best friend. He reached the main road and turned toward town, his truck joining the light mid-morning traffic. Millfield had grown since Harold had moved to its outskirts. New housing developments sprawled where cornfields once stood, and chain stores had largely replaced the family businesses he remembered from his first visits. Change was inevitable, Harold supposed. Everything changed except the past. That remained, stubbornly immutable, replaying in dreams and quiet moments with perfect, agonizing clarity. Harold pulled into the gas station, noticing with dismay the row of motorcycles parked by the air pump. Just his luck. The local motorcycle club had chosen today for a ride. Typically, he would have driven on, returning later when they'd gone, but his medication supply wouldn't last another day. Some confrontations couldn't be avoided. Major Collins took a step closer to Harold, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the older man's face. "You look just like him," he said quietly. "Like who?" Harold asked, his voice steady despite the tremor that had begun in his left hand. "At the mention of Stillwater. Your son, sir, Captain James Winters." Harold's breath caught. "Jamie, you know my son." The bikers had backed away slightly, their interest in harassing an elderly veteran diminishing in the face of what was clearly a more complex situation than they'd bargained for. Crash lingered at the edge of the group, his posture still defiant, but uncertainty evident in his expression. "I served under him in Afghanistan 2010 to 2012, Major Collins explained. "Best commanding officer I ever had. He spoke of you often." Harold's weathered face softened momentarily. "Jamie and I haven't spoken in years." "That's partly why we're here, sir," Agent Kearney interjected gently. "Your son is the one who initiated this process." A mixture of emotions crossed Harold's face. Surprise, confusion, perhaps a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. The VA pharmacy bag in his pocket crinkled as his grip tightened reflexively. Major Collins glanced around the gas station forecourt, now attracting more attention from curious onlookers. "Mr. Winters, we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. Would you be willing to join us for lunch? There's a diner just down the road." Harold hesitated, decades of hard-earned caution warring with curiosity. "You mentioned Stillwater," he said, his voice dropping to ensure only the agents could hear him. "That operation was classified." "Still is, as far as I know, was classified," Agent Richardson corrected, speaking for the first time. His voice was respectful but direct. "The Secretary of Defense signed the declassification order 3 months ago. That's what set this in motion." One of the bikers, younger than the others, with fewer patches on his leather vest, had moved closer again, listening intently. Something about Harold's Silver Star pin seemed to have caught his attention. "You were in Vietnam?" the young biker asked, his tone lacking the mockery of his companions. Harold gave a short nod, unwilling to elaborate. He'd learned long ago that civilians asked questions about war they didn't really want answered. "My old man was there," the biker continued, 101st Airborne. "He didn't talk about it much before he died." "Most of us don't," Harold replied simply. Something in Harold's tone silenced the young man, who stepped back, a new respect evident in his demeanor. The interaction wasn't lost on Crash, whose scowl deepened. "Listen," Crash interrupted, Touching as this reunion is, we've got places to be. So if you could move this little government party elsewhere." Agent Kearney turned to face the biker, fully for the first time. His expression remained pleasant, but something in his eyes made Crash take an involuntary step backward. "Sir, we're conducting official Department of Defense business with a decorated combat veteran," Kearney stated, his voice carrying just enough edge to make his point clear. "I suggest you and your friends continue your ride." Major Collins had moved protectively closer to Harold, his body language sending a clear message to anyone with the sense to read it. Harold noticed the Major's hand briefly touch what was undoubtedly a concealed sidearm beneath his jacket. Not a threat, merely a habitual check. The teenage attendant had ventured out again, emboldened by the presence of authority figures. "Sir," he addressed Harold directly, "your medication is ready inside." The pharmacist called it in. Harold nodded his thanks, his eyes still fixed on Major Collins. "You said my son initiated this?" "Yes, sir. Captain Winters has been pushing for the declassification for years. Once it happened, he immediately filed for a formal review of the record." "Review of what record?" Harold asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. "The action at Firebase Cottonwood," Collins replied. "May 12, 1971. The incident that should have earned you the Medal of Honor, not just the Silver Star." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Even in a society often disconnected from its military, the significance of the Medal of Honor was universally understood. Harold's face had gone pale. "That was a long time ago, Major." "Yes, sir, it was. But some wrongs don't expire." Crash had retreated to his motorcycle, his earlier bravado deflated. The other bikers followed suit, the tension in the air dispelling their appetite for conflict. Only the young biker who had mentioned his father lingered, watching Harold with undisguised curiosity. "I need to get my medication," Harold said finally, his voice betraying fatigue. The adrenaline from the confrontation was wearing off, leaving the familiar ache in his bones. "Of course," Major Collins nodded. "We'll wait, sir. And then, if you're willing, we'd like to buy you lunch and explain exactly why we're here." Harold studied the three men carefully, weighing decades of ingrained caution against the mention of his estranged son. Jamie had sent them, after all. These silent years Jamie had reached back across the divide. "All right," Harold agreed quietly. "But I drive myself. I'll follow you to the diner." Firebase Cottonwood, Quang Tri Province, Vietnam, May 12, 1971. The rain had been falling for 36 hours straight, turning the red clay earth into a sucking quagmire that threatened to pull the boots right off Gunny Winters' feet. The perimeter wire glistened with water droplets, each one catching the intermittent flares that illuminated the darkness beyond their position. "Movement 2 o'clock, Corporal Rodriguez whispered, his young face tense beneath the camouflage paint now streaking in the downpour. Winters raised his binoculars, scanning the tree line. Nothing but shadows and rain. But Rodriguez had the best eyes in the platoon. If he said something was there, Winters believed him. "Alert the captain," Winters ordered softly, but quietly. Could be nothing. Private Jenkins slipped away toward the command bunker while Winters continued to study the perimeter. Firebase Cottonwood wasn't much. A hastily constructed outpost meant to monitor NVA movement along the Laotian border. They were operating with skeleton crew of 38 Marines, half of whom were fresh replacements who'd arrived just days before. Captain Merrill emerged from the bunker moments later, rain plastering his thinning hair to his skull. At 43, he was old for a combat officer, a career Marine who should have been rotating home soon. "What have we got, Gunny?" "Movement in the trees, sir." Rodriguez spotted it first. Merrill squinted into the darkness. Probably just monkeys. Winters didn't contradict his superior officer, but doubt nagged at him. "Sir, request permission to double the watch tonight." "Denied, Gunny. These boys need sleep. We've got that patrol at 0500. Winters nodded, keeping his face neutral despite his disagreement. Merrill was a by-the-book officer who'd somehow made it 3 tours without developing the survival instincts that kept men alive in the jungle. But the bars on his collar meant his word was law. Yes, sir, Winters replied, turning back to the perimeter. 4 hours later, Winters was proved right when the first RPG slammed into the ammunition bunker. The explosion lit up the compound like daylight, followed immediately by the distinctive chatter of AK-47s. "Incoming!" Winters bellowed, already moving toward the nearest gun emplacement. "North perimeter breach!" The fire base erupted into chaos. Half-dressed Marines scrambled for weapons and positions while mortar rounds began to impact within the compound. Through the smoke and rain, Winters could make out the dark figures of NVA regulars pouring through a gap in the wire. Rodriguez, "Jenkins, on me," Winters shouted, gathering his fire team as they fought their way toward the breach. They needed to seal that gap, or the fire base would be overrun within minutes. What followed was the longest 40 minutes of Harold Winters' life. His fire team reached the breached perimeter and established a hasty defense, their M16s cutting down the first wave of attackers. But the NVA kept coming, disciplined soldiers moving in coordinated rushes that spoke of careful planning. "We need reinforcements," Jenkins shouted over the deafening gunfire. Winters keyed his radio, but only static answered him. The command bunker had taken a direct hit early in the assault, killing Captain Merrill and their communications specialist instantly. Winters was effectively in command now, trying to coordinate a defense with broken radio contact and half his men pinned down across the fire base. That's when he saw it, the second breach forming on the eastern perimeter. If the NVA secured that section, they'd have a clear shot at the remaining ammunition supply. The firebase would be lost, and with it, every Marine inside. "Hold this position," Winters ordered Rodriguez. "Jenkins, Peterson, with me." They moved through the compound in short rushes, using burning equipment as cover. Jenkins took a round to the shoulder but kept moving, his young face set in determination. They were 20 yards from the eastern wire when the mortar round hit. Winters came to moments later, ears ringing and vision blurred. Jenkins lay beside him, motionless, half his face missing. Peterson was screaming, clutching the bloody stump where his right leg had been. The eastern perimeter was now completely undefended, despite the shrapnel embedded in his left side and a broken collarbone. Winters dragged Peterson behind a damaged jeep. "Stay here," he ordered, pressing a belt around the young Marine's thigh as a makeshift tourniquet. "Don't leave me, Gunny," Peterson begged, his face ghost white from shock and blood loss. "I'm coming back," Winters promised. "That's an order, Marine. You stay alive." What Harold did next would later be described in the Silver Star citation as extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy force. The official record stated that Gunnery Sergeant Winters, despite severe injuries, single-handedly defended the eastern perimeter until reinforcements arrived, accounting for 17 confirmed enemy casualties. What the citation didn't mention was Lieutenant Michael Cooper, Winters' closest friend since boot camp, who died covering Winters' advance. It didn't mention Private First Class Thomas Rivera, barely 19, who bled out in Winters' arms while whispering his mother's name. It didn't mention how Winters had carried Peterson a mile through enemy territory when the evacuation order finally came, refusing to leave any more Marines behind. Most importantly, the citation didn't mention the bunker, the underground command post where Winters found 3 NVA officers examining maps that shouldn't have existed, detailed schematics of American positions throughout the province. The firefight that ensued destroyed those documents, preventing what intelligence would later confirm was a planned major offensive against American forces. That part of Firebase Cottonwood remained classified, buried in redacted reports and sealed testimonies. Until now. The Bell Creek Diner sat at the edge of Millfield, a time capsule of 1950s Americana with its chrome fixtures and red vinyl booths. Harold sat across from the 3 government men, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. His walker stood propped against the booth within easy reach. "You should eat something, sir," Agent Richardson suggested, nodding toward the untouched turkey sandwich on Harold's plate. Harold ignored the suggestion, his eyes fixed on Major Collins. You mentioned my son initiated this process. Collins nodded, dabbing his mouth with a napkin before responding. Captain Winters has been researching Firebase Cottonwood for nearly a decade. No, when he learned about the intelligence documents you discovered, how did he learn about that? Harold E.C. interrupted sharply. That information was classified. I never told anyone, not even my wife. Your son is Intelligence Corps, Mr. Winters, Kearney explained. He has high-level clearance. When he began looking into your service record, certain discrepancies caught his attention. Harold's expression remained guarded. Jamie and I haven't spoken since his mother's funeral. 8 years now. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Through the diner's wide windows, Harold noticed the group of bikers had reassembled in the parking lot of the gas station across the street. They appeared to be in heated discussion, with the young biker who had mentioned his father gesturing emphatically. Mr. Winters, Major Collins began again, the actions you took at Firebase Cottonwood saved not just the men in your unit, but potentially hundreds of other American servicemen. The intelligence maps you destroyed contained detailed information about troop movements throughout the province. Harold's gaze dropped to his coffee. I was just doing my job. With respect, sir, what you did went far beyond duty. The Silver Star citation only covered your defense of the perimeter. What happened in that bunker, the intelligence you prevented from falling back into enemy hands that deserved the highest recognition. Then why wasn't it recognized? Harold asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Agent Kearney leaned forward. Politics, sir. The NVA officers you encountered in that bunker shouldn't have had those maps. The only way they could have obtained them was through a security breach at division headquarters. Someone high-ranking was passing information. Harold's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee mug. I suspected as much. The investigation? Buried, Richardson confirmed. The commanding general didn't want the scandal. Easier to classify the incident and issue you a Silver Star for the actions that could be publicly acknowledged. The bell above the diner door jingled, drawing Harold's attention. The biker leader, Crash, had entered alone. His swagger remained, but his eyes darted nervously around the restaurant before settling on Harold's table. After a moment's hesitation, he approached. Major Collins subtly shifted in his seat, his hand disappearing beneath his jacket. Agent Richardson likewise tensed, his eyes tracking the biker's movements. Excuse me, Crash said, his voice lacking the mocking tone from earlier. He directed his words to Harold. Can I talk to you for a minute? Harold studied the man's face. Beneath the bravado and leather, he looked young, late 30s perhaps. Say what you need to say. Crash glanced uncomfortably at the government. Agents? Privately? Anything you have to say to me you can say in front of these men, Harold replied firmly. The biker shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. Look, about before at the gas station. The guys and I, we were out of line. Harold's expression didn't change. Yes, you were. Crash flushed slightly at the direct acknowledgement. Ricky, the kid who mentioned his dad was in the 101st, he chewed us out pretty good after you left. Said we should be ashamed disrespecting a veteran like that. And are you? Harold asked. Am I what? Ashamed? The directness of the question seemed to catch Crash off guard. He swallowed visibly. Yeah, I guess I am. My old man was Navy. He'd have tanned my hide if he saw how I acted. Harold nodded once, acknowledging the apology without explicitly accepting it. Crash wasn't finished. The thing is, Ricky recognized your pin. Silver Star, right? His dad had one too. A lot of men did, Harold replied quietly. Ricky wants to talk to you. His dad died last year. Cancer. He never really told Ricky much about Vietnam, and the kids got questions. Harold's face softened slightly. The fathers who don't talk, sometimes those are the ones who saw the worst, Crash nodded. That's what I figured too. He hesitated, then added, Anyway, we're still at the gas station. If you want to talk to him after, whatever this is, he gestured vaguely at the government agents. I'll consider it, Harold said, neither commitment nor dismissal. After Crash left, Harold turned back to Major Collins. You were saying? The classification order on Firebase Cottonwood was maintained for 50 years. Collins continued. The official reason was ongoing intelligence concerns. The real reason was to protect the reputation of men who are now long dead. And now? Harold asked. Now the Secretary of Defense has ordered a complete review of the incident. Your son provided key testimony that corroborated what really happened that night. Jamie wasn't there, Harold pointed out. He was just a boy. No, sir, but he found someone who was, Lieutenant Peterson, the Marine whose life you saved. Harold's coffee mug halted halfway to his lips. David Peterson is alive? Very much so. Retired Colonel David Peterson, now, lives in Virginia. For the first time, genuine emotion broke through Harold's careful reserve. I tried to find him after the war. The VA told me he died from complications. Another convenient lie, Kearney said grimly. Colonel Peterson has been looking for you too, Mr. Winters, for almost 50 years. Agent Kearney placed a thin leather portfolio on the table and slid it toward Harold. This contains the newly declassified reports, sir, including eyewitness testimony from Colonel Peterson and 3 other survivors of Firebase Cottonwood. Harold stared at the portfolio without touching it. For 50 years, he'd compartmentalized that night, storing it in the same mental lockbox where he kept all his wartime memories. Now, these men were asking him to open it willingly. Why now? Harold asked, his voice rougher than before, after all this time. Major Collins exchanged glances with his colleagues before answering. Sir, the Pentagon has been conducting a review of Vietnam-era Valor Awards, specifically looking for cases where recognition may have been denied due to racial bias, political considerations, or classified circumstances. I'm not interested in medals, Harold said flatly. It's not just about the medal, Mr. Winters, Richardson said, speaking with quiet intensity. It's about setting the record straight, for history, for the men who died that night. Harold's weathered hand moved unconsciously to touch the silver star pin on his cap. Cooper, Rivera, Jenkins, they're the ones who deserved recognition. They received posthumous Bronze Stars, Kearney confirmed. But the full extent of their heroism was never acknowledged because of the classification. Harold finally reached for the portfolio, his fingers hesitating briefly before opening it. Inside were photocopies of military documents, many still bearing the diagonal declassified stamps in red ink. He scanned the top page, recognizing the formal language of after-action reports. A photograph slipped from between the pages. 5 young Marines standing before a mud-spattered tent, their arms around each other's shoulders. Harold recognized it as the same photo that sat on his mantel at home. His younger self stared back at him, face leaner, but eyes already carrying the weight that would never fully leave them. Where did you get this? Harold asked, his voice barely audible. Colonel Peterson provided it, Collins answered. He kept a copy all these years. Harold's fingers traced the faces in the photograph. Lieutenant Cooper with his Midwestern grin, Rodriguez cleaning his glasses on his shirt as always, Jenkins looking impossibly young. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was actually submitted twice, Kearney continued. Once immediately after the action by your temporary commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. It was denied due to insufficient documentation, a common excuse when the full details couldn't be disclosed for security reasons. And the second time? Harold asked. 1973. Colonel Peterson submitted it himself after his medical discharge. By then, the political winds had shifted. Vietnam was becoming a war America wanted to forget. The waitress approached their table with a coffee pot, but Major Collins politely waved her away. The gravity of their conversation seemed to register with her, and she retreated without comment. Harold continued to examine the documents, his expression unreadable. Who else knows about this? The review committee at the Pentagon, Collins replied. Your son, of course, Colonel Peterson, and as of 3 days ago, the President. Harold's head snapped up. The President, Kearney nodded. The Medal of Honor requires presidential approval, Mr. Winters. When the committee's recommendation reached his desk, he took a personal interest in your case. For a moment, Harold seemed at a loss for words. The diner continued its normal business. Around them, locals chatting over lunch, the clink of silverware. country music playing softly from overhead speakers. The mundane backdrop stood in stark contrast to the weight of history being discussed at their booth. "The President has authorized us to inform you," Collins continued, "that the Medal of Honor will be presented to you at the White House next month. Your son will be there, along with Colonel Peterson and the surviving members of your unit we've been able to locate." Harold closed the portfolio slowly, his hands steadier than they had been all day. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now, sir," Richardson assured him. "We understand this is a lot to process." Through the window, Harold noticed the young biker, Ricky, standing by his motorcycle, occasionally glancing toward the diner. The others in his group seemed to be waiting as well, their earlier aggression replaced by what looked like awkward uncertainty. "Did Peterson tell you everything?" Harold asked suddenly. "About what happened in the bunker?" The agents exchanged glances. "He told us what he knew," Collins answered carefully. "But he was outside, guarding your escape route. Only you know exactly what transpired inside." Harold nodded, seeming to come to a decision. "There's something not in those reports, something I never told anyone." The three men leaned forward slightly, their training keeping their expressions neutral, despite their evident interest. "The NVA officer in charge," Harold continued, his voice dropping to ensure only they could hear him. "When I entered the command bunker, he was on the radio. I speak enough Vietnamese to understand what he was saying." Harold paused, the memory clearly painful to revisit. He was confirming the coordinates for the next day's B-52 strike, coordinates that had been provided by someone on our side. Kearney's expression darkened. "A bombing run on our own troops. 2 companies of Marines," Harold confirmed grimly. "Over 300 men. The maps showed their exact positions." "My God," Collins breathed. "The investigation into the leak was shut down before it began," Harold finished for him. "Whoever their source was, they had enough influence to bury it completely." "And you never reported this? Even after the war?" Richardson asked. Harold's eyes, when they met the younger agents, carried 5 decades of weariness. Who would have believed a gunnery sergeant over whoever was giving those coordinates? By the time I was medevaced to Japan, the official story was already written. Outside the diner, the bikers had gathered around Ricky, their body language suggesting an intense discussion. Crash stood slightly apart, his attention fixed on the diner's entrance while the others talked. "Should we just leave?" one of the bikers asked, adjusting his leather vest uncomfortably. Ricky shook his head firmly. "No way. You saw that silver star. My dad had one, and he never talked about how he got it. Said some things were better left in the jungle." "Those government guys look like they mean business," another biker commented. "Feds, probably." Crash remained silent, watching the diner with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. At 42, he was the oldest in the group, though not the most mature, a distinction he'd readily admit. The leather, the bike, the attitude, all of it was armor against a world that had never quite made sense to him. "You know," he finally said, "my old man was stationed in Subic Bay during Nam. Navy mechanic, used to fix the aircraft carriers. When they came in from the Gulf of Tonkin," the others turned to him, surprised. Crash rarely mentioned his father. "He came back different, Mom always said. Started drinking, couldn't hold a job." Crash's voice took on an edge they seldom heard. "Left when I was 8. Last I heard, he was living under a bridge in San Diego." Ricky moved closer to Crash, genuine, concern replacing his usual deference to the older rider. "You never told us that," Crash shrugged, discomfort evident in the gesture. "Not exactly the kind of story that fits with the whole badass biker image, is it?" The men fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Their motorcycle club, the Iron Disciples, wasn't one of the notorious outlaw gangs that dominated headlines. They were weekend warriors, mostly. Construction workers, mechanics, and factory employees who found brotherhood on the open road. "My grandfather was at Iwo Jima," offered another rider, a barrel-chested man called Bear. "Marine Corps. Never said a word about it my whole life, but he kept a Japanese flag in his closet. Found it after he died." Ricky kicked at the gravel beneath his boot. "That old guy in there, He reminds me of my dad before the cancer really took hold. Same look in his eyes. Inside the leather vests and behind the tattoos, each man seemed to be reassessing the morning's events, their earlier mockery of Harold now sitting uncomfortably in their memories. "So what do we do?" asked the youngest member, a recent addition to their group. "We apologize properly," Crash decided, his voice leaving no room for argument. "All of us. And then we offer to escort him home." He glanced at the black SUV parked nearby. "After he's done with whatever government business he's handling." Inside the diner, Harold had fallen silent after revealing the truth about the radio transmission he'd intercepted. The three government men exchanged troubled glances. "That would explain why the classification was maintained for so long, Agent," Kearney said finally. "A planned friendly fire incident of that magnitude would have been devastating to public support for the war," Major Collins finished grimly. "Even more so if it was deliberately orchestrated." Harold looked tired suddenly, the weight of the morning, and the past 50 years visible in the slump of his shoulders. "I did what I had to do, destroyed the maps, eliminated the threat. The bombing never happened. At great personal and utter cost," Richardson noted quietly. Harold's left hand moved unconsciously to his right leg, where the worst of the shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. The injury had never fully healed, deteriorating over the decades into the disability that now required his walker. "The men who died that night," Harold said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "They're the ones who paid the cost. I just carried the memory." Through the window, Harold noticed Crash approaching the diner again, this time accompanied by the entire group of bikers. Their demeanor had changed remarkably since the gas station confrontation. Leather-clad heads, slightly bowed, the swagger gone from their stride. Major Collins noticed Harold's attention shift. "Would you like us to ask them to leave, sir?" Harold shook his head slowly. "No, I think I'd like to hear what they have to say." The bell above the door jingled as the bikers entered, drawing curious stares from the diner's other patrons. In a moment, the small town of Mill Field, the site of the local motorcycle club filing respectfully into the restaurant, was unusual enough to warrant attention. Crash led the group, stopping a respectful distance from Harold's table. "Mr. Winters," he began, using the honorific that had been absent from their earlier interaction, "we'd like to apologize. Properly this time." He glanced at his companions, who nodded in agreement. Harold studied the men before him. Different generations, different wars, but something familiar in their eyes nonetheless. The Brotherhood of the Road wasn't so different from the Brotherhood of Arms in some ways. "Apology accepted," Harold said simply. Ricky stepped forward slightly. "Sir, I was wondering, my dad was with the 101st Airborne in Hugh and later near the DMZ, Staff Sergeant William Parker." Harold considered for a moment. "I didn't know many airborne personally. Different operational areas most of the time." Disappointment flashed across Ricky's face, quickly masked. "But," Harold continued, noticing the young man's reaction, "I met a few good soldiers." "Your father was a staff sergeant, you said?" Ricky nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. Got a Bronze Star, but he would never talk about it." "Some men can't," Harold said gently. "Doesn't mean they don't want to. Sometimes the words just aren't enough." The wisdom in the simple statement seemed to strike Ricky deeply. He blinked rapidly, looking away for a moment to compose himself. "When you're finished here," Crash said, gesturing vaguely toward the drum. "Government agents, we'd be honored to escort you home, sir. Make sure you get there safely." After the bikers had withdrawn to wait outside, promising to return when Harold was ready, Major Collins excused himself to make a phone call. He stepped outside the diner, moving to a quiet corner of the parking lot where he could speak privately. Inside, Agent Kearney slid a business card across the table to Harold. "The ceremony is scheduled for June 15th, sir. We've arranged transportation for you to Washington, of course. The President specifically requested that this be handled with the honor it deserves." Harold picked up the card, studying it without comment. His weathered fingers traced the embossed Department of Defense seal. "Will you call your son?" Agent Richardson asked carefully. Harold's expression remained unreadable. 8 years is a long time. "Not compared to 50, Richardson observed gently. The waitress returned with fresh coffee, eyeing the leather portfolio with curiosity. Small-town inquisitiveness was working overtime today. First government agents, then the local bikers showing unprecedented respect to an elderly veteran. By evening, speculation would be racing through Millfield. "Captain Winters has been instrumental in this entire process, sir," Kearney continued. "He spent years piecing together what happened at Firebase Cottonwood." Harold's gaze drifted to the window, where he could see Major Collins pacing slowly as he spoke on his phone. "Jamie and we have our differences." He mentioned that, Richardson acknowledged. "But he also said that whatever happened between you, he never doubted you deserved this recognition." A subtle shift crossed Harold's features, not quite a smile, but perhaps the ghost of one. "He's stubborn, gets that from his mother, outside." Major Collins's conversation had become more animated. His free hand gestured emphatically as he spoke, his posture radiating tension even through the glass. "Is something wrong?" Harold asked, nodding toward the window. Kearney glanced outside. "I'm not sure, excuse me for a moment." He slid from the booth and headed for the door. Left alone with Agent Richardson, Harold finally took a bite of his now cold sandwich. The simple act of eating seemed to ground him, bringing him back from the memories that had dominated the conversation. "Did you serve?" Harold asked the young agent. Richardson nodded. "Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Combat?" "Yes, sir. 10th Mountain Division." Harold nodded with simple understanding. No further questions were necessary. The shared experience of war created its own language, spoken in silences as much as words. The diner's door opened again, admitting not only Kearney, but Major Collins as well. Both men's expressions had tightened considerably. "What is it?" Harold asked immediately, military instincts still sharp despite the decades. Collins slid back into the booth. "That was the Pentagon, sir. Someone leaked information about your Medal of Honor to the press. It's already hitting the news cycle." "How is that possible?" Richardson asked. "The declassification was just completed. We're investigating," Collins replied grimly. "But the bigger issue is that details about Firebase Cottonwood are becoming public, including speculation about the friendly fire incident that was prevented." Harold's face darkened. "Names?" "Not yet," Collins assured him. "But it's only a matter of time before reporters start digging." As if on cue, the door to the diner swung open again. A woman in her 40s entered, scanning the restaurant until her gaze settled on their table. Her purposeful stride and the press credentials hanging around her neck identified her profession before she even reached them. "Mr. Winters?" she began, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah Donnelly from the Millfield Gazette. I understand congratulations are in order." Collins stepped smoothly between them. "Ma'am, this is a private meeting." The reporter's smile didn't waver. "Of course, Major. I just wanted to introduce myself to our local hero. The Pentagon press office confirmed a few minutes ago that Mr. Winters is receiving the Medal of Honor next month. It's the biggest story to hit Millfield in years." Harold remained silent, his expression closing like a shutter. "Perhaps we could schedule an interview later this week," she pressed. "Our readers would love to hear about your experiences in Vietnam." "Ms. Donnelly," Kearney intervened, his voice professionally cordial but firm. "Mr. Winters has only just been informed about the medal himself. This is a personal moment." The reporter glanced between them, professional instincts clearly warring with basic courtesy. "Of course. My apologies for the intrusion." She placed her business card on the table. "When you're ready to talk, Mr. Winters, I'd be honored to tell your story properly." After she departed, Harold looked to Collins. "How long before this becomes a circus?" "It already has, sir," Collins admitted. "By tonight, every news outlet in the country will be running the story. The first Medal of Honor from Vietnam to be awarded in over 20 years, based on newly declassified information. It's Major D.D. news." Harold closed his eyes briefly. "And my cabin is 3 miles down a dirt road, perfect for ambush by reporters." The agents exchanged glances, clearly not having considered this aspect of the situation. "We can arrange security," Kearney offered, "or temporary accommodations elsewhere until the ceremony." Harold shook his head. "No, I'm not leaving my home." Outside, the bikers remained in the parking lot, maintaining their vigil. Crash noticed the reporter exiting the diner and heading for her car, press credentials visible. His eyes narrowed slightly as he turned to his companions. "Looks like the story's already getting out," he observed. Ricky straightened from where he'd been leaning against his motorcycle. "What do we do?" Crash watched the reporter's car pull away, a plan already forming. "We adapt. Our escort just became a security detail." The convoy that departed the Bell Creek Diner created quite a spectacle, the black government SUV leading, followed by Harold in his pickup truck, with 6 motorcycles forming a protective escort behind. As they passed through Millfield's modest downtown, curious faces appeared in shop windows, and pedestrians stopped to stare. "There goes our low profile," Agent Kearney remarked from the passenger seat of the SUV. Major Collins nodded grimly as he drove. "Small towns. News travels faster than internet here." By the time they reached the turnoff to Harold's property, 3 news vans were already parked on the shoulder of the main road. Reporters with cameras stood ready, clearly having been tipped off about Harold's residence. Collins slowed the SUV, assessing the situation. In his rearview mirror, he could see Harold's truck stopping a safe distance behind. The bikers, however, continued forward, positioning their motorcycles in a line that effectively blocked the access road. Crash dismounted first, approaching the reporters with surprising diplomacy. "Folks, this is private property. Mr. Winters isn't giving interviews today." "The public has a right to know about a Medal of Honor recipient," one reporter countered, camera still rolling. "And Mr. Winters has a right to privacy," Crash responded firmly, "especially today." The standoff might have escalated if not for the arrival of a police cruiser, lights flashing as it pulled alongside the news vans. Chief Sanders, Millfield's lone full-time law enforcement officer, stepped out with a weary expression that suggested this wasn't the peaceful afternoon he'd anticipated. "What's going on here, Crash?" the chief asked, eyeing the unusual alliance of bikers and government agents with open curiosity. "Just helping Mr. Winters get home without being harassed, Chief," Crash replied. Chief Sanders surveyed the scene, his gaze lingering on the government SUV before settling on Harold's pickup. Recognition dawned on his face. "Harold Winters? From?" "Out on Old Mill Road." Major Collins approached, extending his credentials. "Major Collins, Department of Defense. We're escorting Mr. Winters home following an official notification." The chief examined the credentials carefully. "Notification of what exactly?" "Mr. Winters will be receiving the Medal of Honor next month at the White House," Collins explained, keeping his voice low. "The news has leaked to the press faster than anticipated." Chief Sanders' eyebrows shot up. "Harold Winters, a Medal of Honor?" He looked again at the pickup truck where Harold remained seated, barely visible through the windshield. "I've known him for 15 years. He comes into town once a month for his medication and supplies. Never said a word about Vietnam." "That's rather the point, Chief," Collins replied. "Mr. Winters values his privacy. We'd appreciate your help." "In ensuring he gets it," the chief straightened, professionalism overriding his surprise. "Of course." He turned to the gathered reporters. "Folks, you're blocking a public road. I'm going to have to ask you to move your vehicles." "We're just trying to get a statement, Chief," one reporter protested. "You can try again another day," Sanders replied firmly. "For now, you need to clear the road or face obstruction charges." As the news crews reluctantly began to pack up, Chief Sanders approached Harold's truck. Harold rolled down his window, regarding the police officer with cautious neutrality. "Mr. Winters," Sanders began, removing his hat respectfully, "I had no idea all these years." "Nothing to know, Chief," Harold replied simply. Sanders seemed to struggle with this response. "A Medal of Honor isn't nothing, sir." "It is until they actually give it to me," Harold said. "Right now, I'd just like to get home." The chief nodded, stepping back. "I'll make sure you do, sir. And I'll have my deputies run regular patrols past your property for the next few days. Keep the media at bay." Harold nodded his thanks, then rolled his window back up, effectively ending the conversation. As the convoy continued down the dirt road toward Harold's cabin, the government agents in the lead, Crash pulled his motorcycle. Alongside Harold's truck, the veteran glanced over, giving a small nod of acknowledgement. Harold's cabin came into view around the final bend, a modest structure of weathered wood and stone set back from the road among tall pines. A covered porch wrapped around two sides, furnished with simple wooden chairs positioned to face the forest. Solar panels on the sloped roof provided basic electricity, complemented by the generator for which Harold had been purchasing fuel. The place spoke of self-sufficiency and solitude, qualities Harold had cultivated since moving to Millfield 15 years earlier. Few townspeople had ever visited his home, and fewer still knew anything about the man who lived there. "Nice setup," Crash commented as they pulled into the small clearing that served as a driveway. Harold eyed him with measured assessment. "Private, usually," Crash nodded, understanding the implication. "We won't stay long. Just wanted to make sure you got home safely." He hesitated, then added, "And to apologize properly for this morning." Harold's weathered face softened slightly. Already forgotten. Major Collins approached as Harold exited his truck, walker in hand. "Mr. Winters, we'd like to post an agent overnight, given the media interest, just as a precaution." Harold shook his head firmly. "Not necessary, Major. I've managed on my own this long." Before Collins could argue, Ricky stepped forward from the group of bikers. "Sir, we'd be happy to take shifts keeping an eye on the road. Make sure no reporters make it through." The offer hung in the air, unexpected and sincere. Harold studied the young man, barely older than his own son had been when they'd had their falling out. "Why would you do that?" Harold asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. Ricky glanced at his fellow bikers before answering. "Because my dad would have wanted someone to do the same for him." He paused, then added quietly, "And because we were wrong this morning, we want to make it right." Harold considered this, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded once. "Two of you, at the turnoff from the main road, no closer. If anyone heads this way that isn't Chief Sanders, call my phone." He produced an ancient flip phone from his pocket. "I still know how to handle unwanted visitors," Crash nodded seriously. "Yes, sir. You won't even know we're there." As the arrangements were finalized, Agent Richardson approached Harold with a small satellite phone. "This is secure, sir. If you need to reach us directly, the number for Captain Winters is programmed in as well." Harold accepted the device with visible reluctance. "I don't suppose turning down the medal is an option at this point." Major Collins smiled slightly. "I'm afraid that train has left the station, sir. By tomorrow, you'll be the most famous resident in Millfield's history." Night had fallen by the time Harold was finally alone. The government agents had departed with promises to return the following day. The bikers had established their watch at the end of the road, Crash and Bear taking the first shift. Only the bee. Sounds of the forest remained, the soft hooting of an owl, the rustle of pines in the evening breeze. Harold sat on his porch, a glass of bourbon beside him, his one concession to the day's revelations. The leather portfolio lay unopened on his lap, its contents still largely unexamined. Some truths were better approached in darkness, when no one could see your reaction to them. Finally, he opened it, using his battery-powered lantern to illuminate the documents inside. The declassified reports were extensive, detailing not just the attack on Firebase Cottonwood, but the intelligence implications of what Harold had discovered in that bunker. Names had been redacted even in these newly released files. Black. Rectangles obscuring the identities of those involved in the investigation. Harold sipped his bourbon, feeling the familiar burn. He hadn't touched alcohol in nearly a month, a personal discipline rather than any formal sobriety. Tonight seemed to warrant an exception. A photograph slipped from between the pages, not the one of his unit that he'd seen earlier, but a formal, military portrait of Lieutenant Michael Cooper. Young, serious, eyes already holding shadows despite the official smile. Harold's closest friend, dead 50 years this very day. "Should have been you getting this medal, Coop," Harold murmured, too. The photograph. "Always were better at everything than me." The satellite phone Richardson had given him sat on the small table beside his chair, its presence somehow accusatory. Jamie's number was programmed in. One button would connect him to his son after 8 years of silence. 8 years since Catherine's funeral, where their simmering disagreements had finally erupted into open conflict. Jamie, career military like his father, had wanted Harold to move closer after Catherine's death. Harold had refused, unwilling to become a burden. Stubborn pride on both sides had calcified into estrangement, and now Jamie had spent years working to secure his father recognition Harold had never sought. The portfolio contained more than just military documents. Near the back, Harold found newspaper clippings, recent ones, detailing Captain James Winters' efforts to have Vietnam-era Valor Awards reviewed. His son had become something of an advocate for aging veterans, it seemed. Just like your mother, Harold said softly. Catherine had always been the activist, the fighter. Harold had done his fighting in war. She had done hers in peace. Deeper in the file, Harold found something unexpected. A handwritten letter on Department of Defense letterhead. The signature at the bottom belonged to Colonel David Peterson. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he began to read. Dear Gunny, they tell me they've finally found you. 50 years too late, but better than never. I've been looking since '75 when I got back on my feet enough to start searching. They told me you were dead. Can you believe that? Some bureaucratic mix-up, they claimed later. I knew better. I still have the leg you saved, though it's never been much good. Doctors wanted to take it twice more over the years. I kept refusing. Seemed wrong somehow after what you went through to save it. I've told the story so many times. To the review board, to investigators, to your son when he finally tracked me down 3 years ago. How you carried me through enemy territory with your own wounds pouring blood. How you refused evacuation until the other wounded were loaded first. How you never once complained despite injuries that would have had lesser men screaming, they're finally going to make it right, Gunny, the medal you earned that night. The recognition that politics denied you. I have children, grandchildren now, a good life. None of it would have happened without you. I'll be there when they put that medal around your neck. I've waited 50 years to shake your hand properly. And say what needs saying. Thank you for my life, Gunny Winters, Semper Fi, David Peterson Colonel, USMC, Ret. Harold carefully folded the letter and returned it to the portfolio. The night air suddenly felt cooler, and he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Harold had known recipients during the war, had stood in their presence with appropriate awe. Never once had he imagined joining their ranks. The satellite phone seemed to grow heavier on the table beside him. Jamie was out there somewhere, waiting for a call that might never come. 50 years had passed before Harold's actions at Firebase, Cottonwood, were properly recognized. How much longer would he wait before reaching out to his only son? Harold picked up the phone, turning it over in his calloused hands. The bourbon in his glass caught the lantern light, amber and gold-like. The autumn sun through trees, like the fire that had consumed the command bunker after Harold had eliminated the NVA officers and destroyed their intelligence. Some fires purified, others merely destroyed. Harold had lived with the ashes of Firebase Cottonwood for half a century. The phone felt impossibly heavy as his thumb hovered over the call button. Jamie's name glowed on the small screen, a digital bridge across 8 years of silence. Before Harold could decide whether to press it, headlights appeared at the far end of his driveway, moving slowly through the trees. Not the government SUV returning, nor one of the bikers' motorcycles. Harold set down the phone and bourbon, military instincts returning as he reached for the drawer beneath his chair where he kept his old service pistol. The headlights drew closer, illuminating the clearing before Harold's cabin. He recognized the vehicle, Crash's truck, not his motorcycle. The biker must have switched vehicles at some point during the evening. Harold relaxed his grip on the pistol, but didn't return it to the drawer. Years of survival instincts weren't easily dismissed. Crash parked and approached the porch cautiously, hands visible. Mr. Winters? Sorry to disturb you, sir. We caught a reporter trying to sneak up. Your road. Thought you should know. Harold nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Sit, if you want." Crash hesitated, then climbed the porch steps and lowered himself into the offered seat. His eyes fell on the open portfolio, the military documents visible in the lantern. "Light, is that from Vietnam?" he asked, a note of genuine curiosity in his voice. Harold closed the portfolio. "Yes." Silence settled between them, not entirely uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken questions. Crash's gaze drifted to the service pistol still in Harold's hand. M1911, Crash identified the weapon. "My dad had one from his Navy days." Harold raised an eyebrow, mildly impressed by the biker's knowledge. "Standard issue, reliable." "Mind if I ask what happened?" "Over there, I mean," Crash ventured. When Harold's expression closed, he quickly added, "No pressure. My old man never talked about it either." Harold considered the man beside him, so different from his own generation in appearance, yet perhaps not so different underneath. "Why does it matter to you?" Crash shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question. "Ricky's got me thinking about his dad, about mine." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I gave my old man a lot of grief for disappearing. Never really considered what he might have been carrying from the war." Harold took a measured sip of bourbon. "War changes you. Some men handle it better than others. Is that why you live all the way out here, away from everyone?" "A fair question," Harold acknowledged silently. "Partly. After my wife died, there didn't seem much point in staying around people." Crash nodded slowly. "I get that. After my divorce, I lived in my truck for 6 months, couldn't stand walls." Another silence, more companionable than the first. Harold found himself unexpectedly comfortable with the biker's presence. Perhaps loneliness had worn down his edges more than he'd realized. "Your son," Crash said eventually. "The captain that the government guys mentioned." "You two don't talk?" Harold's jaw tightened. "That's right. But he's the one who pushed for your medal." Harold nodded once, not trusting his voice. Crash seemed to be working through something in his mind. "My kid's 15. Haven't seen him in 3 years. His mom got remarried, moved to Oregon." He rubbed his tattooed knuckles absently. "Keep telling myself I'll go visit, but something always comes up." Harold recognized the self-deception in Crash's words, the same lies he'd told himself about contacting Jamie over the years. "Always later, always tomorrow. Don't wait too long," Harold said finally. "Years go by faster than you think." Crash's attention had returned to the portfolio. "That file, does it say what happened? The thing they're giving you the medal for?" "Yes, must have been something," Crash observed. Harold set his bourbon down. "I lost 3 good friends that night. Nothing heroic about that." "With respect, sir, they don't give out medals of honor for nothing." Harold studied the younger man's face, finding genuine interest rather than mere curiosity. "Firebase Cottonwood, May 12, 1971. We were overrun by NVA regulars. I was just doing my job. Saving others? Some, not all." The weight of that night pressed down on Harold anew. Never enough. Crash's expression changed subtly, recognition dawning. "You're him, aren't you? The Marine who carried his wounded through enemy territory? My old man told me that story once when I was a kid." Harold frowned. "What are you talking about?" "There was this story that went around the Navy, about a Marine gunny who carried a lieutenant with a mangled leg through enemy lines after their base got hit. Dad said it was one of those legends everyone knew." Crash leaned forward. "That was you?" Harold's surprise was genuine. "I didn't know anyone told that story." "Are you kidding? Dad said it was like, I don't know, inspiration or something. That even when everything went to hell, there were still guys who wouldn't leave anyone behind." Harold fell silent, processing this unexpected information. All these years, he'd believed Firebase Cottonwood was buried in classified files and fading memories. The idea that his actions had become some kind of military legend was unsettling. "Your father," Harold said carefully. "What was his name?" "Thomas Reynolds. Petty officer on the USS Constellation." Harold shook his head. "Doesn't sound familiar." "He wouldn't have been. Just one of thousands of sailors. But he knew your story somehow." Crash gestured to the portfolio. Guess it wasn't as classified as they thought. Harold's mind worked through the implications. If Crash's father knew the story, how many others did as well? Had Jamie grown up hearing similar tales, never knowing they were about his own father? "Mr. Winters," Crash said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "the guys and I were talking. We'd like to escort you to Washington for the ceremony." Harold blinked, taken aback by the offer. Why would you do that? Honestly, to make up for being such assholes this morning, Crash smiled slightly. And because guys like you, there aren't many left. Seems right to show some respect? Something shifted in Harold's chest, a loosening of a knot he'd carried so long he'd forgotten. It was there. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps its distant cousin. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Crash nodded, accepting this as neither rejection nor agreement. He gestured toward Harold's nearly empty glass. "Mind if I join you in a drink, sir?" "Just one, since I'm driving." Harold considered the request, then reached inside the small side table and produced a second glass. For the first time in years, he had company on his porch, under the stars. Morning arrived with the buzz of activity Millfield hadn't seen in decades. News vans lined Main Street, reporters prepared live shots for national broadcasts, and locals gathered in small clusters outside the diner and town hall, sharing what little they knew about their suddenly famous neighbor. Can you believe it? Harold Winters, a Medal of Honor recipient, living right under our noses all this time, Martha Gaines, the town's longtime librarian, remarked to anyone who would listen. He's been coming in for books twice a month for 15 years. Military. History, mostly. Never said a word about his own service. Chief Sanders had established a perimeter around Harold's property, stationing his 2 part-time deputies at the entrance to the access road. The bikers remained as well, having appointed themselves unofficial guardians. Their presence created an unusual alliance that confused the media. Leather-clad motorcycle enthusiasts working alongside local law enforcement to protect a Vietnam veteran's privacy. By mid-morning, Major Collins arrived with his colleagues, navigating through the media gauntlet with practiced efficiency. They found Harold on his porch dressed in the same pressed khakis and button-down shirt he'd worn the day before. Only the addition of a freshly ironed blue blazer acknowledged. "The significance of the day, sir," Collins greeted him respectfully. "I'm afraid things have escalated overnight." Harold nodded, unsurprised. "I heard the helicopters." "News choppers," Kearney confirmed. "We've asked them to maintain distance from your property, but they're determined." "The mayor has requested a public statement," Richardson added. "Just a brief appearance to satisfy the media's interest. She's arranged something at the town hall at noon." Harold's expression remained impassive. "Seems I don't have much choice." "You always have a choice, sir," Collins assured him. "If you prefer to avoid the attention, we can arrange to move you to a secure location until the Washington ceremony." Harold shook his head. "No, if I have to do this, might as well be here. These are my neighbors, after all." The drive into town resembled a parade more than a simple journey. The government SUV led the way, followed by Harold in the passenger seat of Crash's truck, with the remaining bikers forming an honor guard on their motorcycles. Residents lined the route, many waving. American flags hastily purchased from the hardware store that morning. "Quite a reception," Crash observed, navigating carefully through the crowded streets. Harold stared straight ahead, his discomfort with the attention evident in his rigid posture. "Never understood parade," he muttered, "especially for doing your job." The town hall, a modest brick building dating from the 1930s, had been hastily decorated with patriotic bunting. A podium stood on the steps, microphones clustered at its front. A crowd had gathered in the small square, a mixture of curious locals and assembled media. Mayor Wilson, a woman in her 60s who had led Millfield for nearly 20 years, rushed forward as Harold emerged from the truck. "Mr. Winters, such an honor, truly. We're also proud." Harold acknowledged her with a nod, his eyes scanning the crowd. He recognized faces from his infrequent trips to town, the pharmacist who filled his prescriptions, the cashier from the grocery store, the barber who cut his hair every third month without fail. People who had been polite strangers for 15 years now looked at him with something approaching reverence. "If you could just say a few words," the mayor continued, guiding him toward the podium. "The national press is here, CNN, Fox News, everyone." Harold's steps slowed as they approached the microphones. Major Collins moved protectively to his side. "You don't have to do this if you're uncomfortable, sir." Before Harold could respond, a commotion at the edge of the crowd drew their attention. A man in military dress uniform was making his way through the throng, reporters parting before him. Harold froze, recognition immediate despite the years of separation. The same strong jaw, the same purposeful stride. Catherine's eyes. "Dad?" Captain James Winters said, as he reached them, his voice carrying despite the surrounding noise. For a moment, father and son stood facing each other, 8 years of silence hanging between them. Then, with military precision, Jamie snapped to attention and rendered a perfect salute to his father. "Captain James Winters reporting as requested, sir." Harold's composure wavered for the first time since the government agents had appeared at the gas station. "I didn't request you, son." "No, sir, but I thought you might need backup for this operation." A ghost of a smile crossed Jamie's face, so like his mother's that Harold felt his chest tighten. Without conscious decision, Harold returned the salute. The gesture, formal as it was, bridged something of the distance between them. Mayor Wilson, sensing a moment, urged them both toward the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the assembled crowd, "I present to you Millfield's own hero, soon to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor, Mr. Harold Winters, and his son, Captain James Winters." Applause erupted, cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions. Harold approached the microphones with visible reluctance. Jamie remained at his side, a step behind his father's right shoulder, the position of a supporting officer. "Mr. Winters, how does it feel to receive this recognition after 50 years?" a reporter called out. Harold leaned slightly toward the microphones. "It feels unnecessary," he said simply. A murmur ran through the crowd at this unexpected response. "The men who died that night are the ones who deserved recognition," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger. "Lieutenant Michael Cooper, Private Jenkins, Corporal Rodriguez, they gave everything. I just came home." Jamie stepped closer to his father, not touching him, but offering his presence as support. "Mr. Winters, will you tell us what happened at Iowa Firebase Cottonwood?" another reporter asked. Harold shook his head once. "No." Before the disappointed press could protest, Jamie leaned toward the microphones. "My father's actions have been classified for 50 years for national security reasons. The details remain sensitive even now. What matters is that his courage saved American lives and prevented a potential tragedy of immense proportions." The professional delivery seemed to satisfy the media more than Harold's blunt refusal. Cameras continued to roll as Jamie fielded questions with practiced ease, protecting his father from the worst of the intrusive inquiries. Throughout it all, Harold stood straight, his military bearing evident despite his age, and the walker positioned just behind him. To those who knew what to look for, the signs of his combat experience were visible beneath the civilian clothes. The way he continuously scanned the crowd, his positioning that all was allowed a clear view of exits, the careful distance he maintained from unknown individuals. As the impromptu press conference continued, Harold's gaze drifted to the bikers stationed at the edge of the crowd. Crash nodded respectfully, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. From reluctant adversaries to unlikely allies in less than 24 hours, the sort of transformation that only shared understanding could create. As the press conference wound down, a commotion at the edge of the crowd caught Harold's attention. A group of older men had arrived, many wearing veterans' caps or jackets bearing unit insignia. They stood together, a quiet island of dignity. Amid the media frenzy, "Dad," Jamie said quietly, "there are some people here to see you." Harold followed his son's gaze, recognition dawning as he studied the gathered veterans. Men his age or older, bearing the unmistakable look of those who had seen combat, stood watching him with solemn respect. Mayor Wilson, sensing an opportunity, approached the microphone again. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have members of our local veterans of foreign wars post here to pay their respects to Mr. Winters. The crowd parted as the veterans made their way forward. Their leader, a tall man with a VFW commander's cap, approached Harold with military bearing. "Gunnery Sergeant Winters," he said, rendering a crisp salute. "Commander Bill McKenzie, VFW Post 4872. We came as soon as we heard." Harold returned the salute, the gesture automatic after all these years. "At ease, Commander." McKenzie extended his hand. "We've been in the same town for 15 years, and I never knew we had a Medal of Honor recipient among us." "Don't have it yet," Harold pointed out, though he accepted the handshake. Formality, McKenzie dismissed with a knowing smile. "The citation's what matters, and yours has been declassified." He gestured to the men behind him. "We've got representatives from 3 wars here today: Vietnam, Gulf, Afghanistan, Iraq, came to show our respect." One by one, the veterans approached Harold, each offering a salute or handshake. No excessive words, no effusive praise, just the simple acknowledgement of one warrior to another. Harold accepted each greeting with quiet dignity, visibly more comfortable with these men than with the reporters and cameras. A gray-haired man in a wheelchair made his way forward, assisted by what appeared to be his son. "Corporal Daniel Hayes, 1st Marines," he introduced himself, "was at Khe Sanh in '68. Harold nodded. "Tough fight. Heard about you, though," Hayes continued. "The gunny who carried his lieutenant through NVA territory. Story made the rounds even back then." Harold glanced at Jamie, who watched the interaction with evident surprise. The classified nature of Firebase Cottonwood had apparently not prevented the story from spreading through unofficial channels. "Exaggerated, I'm sure," Harold demurred. Hayes shook his head firmly. "Don't think so. We all knew what that would have taken." The wheelchair-bound veteran reached out to grasp Harold's hand. "Should have gotten that medal a long time ago, Gunny." As the veterans continued to arrive, forming an impromptu honor guard around Harold, the media's attention shifted. This was no longer just a story about a long-delayed medal. It was a living testament to the brotherhood forged in combat, spanning generations and transcending wars. Ricky had approached Jamie, speaking quietly while gesturing toward his fellow bikers. Whatever he said caused Jamie to nod thoughtfully before making his way back to his father's side. "The Iron Disciples want to know if you'd accept their escort to Washington next month," Jamie informed Harold, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Apparently they feel they have a reputation to redeem." Harold's gaze found Crash among the crowd. "Told them I'd think about it." "It's not the worst idea," Jamie suggested carefully. "Would make quite a statement. Vietnam vet with motorcycle honor guard." Before Harold could respond, another ripple moved through the crowd as 3 Marine Corps dress uniforms appeared at the town hall entrance. Major Collins approached them, exchanged a few words, then hurried back to Harold. "Sir," Collins said, barely contained excitement in his voice, "we have some unexpected visitors." The 3 Marines made their way through the parting crowd. A colonel, a major, and a sergeant major, all in full dress blues. Harold straightened instinctively, military bearing taking over despite his civilian clothes and the walker he leaned on. "Gunnery Sergeant Harold Winters?" the colonel asked formally as they reached him. "Yes, sir," Harold confirmed. The colonel saluted sharply. "Colonel Michael Rayburn, representing the Commandant of the Marine Corps. The Commandant sends his personal regards and apologizes that he could not be here himself. News of your Medal of Honor has traveled quickly through the corps." Harold returned the salute, his face betraying subtle surprise at this level of attention. The sergeant major stepped forward next, his chest bearing rows of combat decorations. "Sergeant Major Wallace, sir. It's an honor." He handed Harold a small box. "The Commandant asked us to present you with this as a token of the Corps' esteem while we await the official ceremony." Harold opened the box to find a Marine Corps emblem pin, the eagle, globe, and anchor, that every Marine recognized as the symbol of their service. "Once a Marine, always a Marine, Gunny," the sergeant major said quietly. "The Corps never forgot you, even if the paperwork got delayed." For the first time since the government agents had appeared at the gas station, Harold's composure cracked visibly. His weathered hand closed around the emblem, 50 years of memory evident in his eyes. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," he managed, his voice rougher than before. The Marine Major produced an envelope bearing official seals. "The Commandant has also arranged for a Marine honor flight to transport you to Washington for the ceremony, sir. Full honors." Jamie watched his father, carefully recognizing the emotions Harold was struggling to contain. He stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on his father's shoulder, the first physical contact between them in 8 years. "Dad," Jamie said softly, "it's okay to accept this." Harold looked at his son, seeing not just the officer, but the boy he'd raised, the child who had once worn his oversized cover around the house, playing Marine. Whatever words might have followed were interrupted by the sound of helicopter rotors growing louder. A Marine Corps helicopter appeared overhead, circling once before hovering near the town square. The crowd gasped and pointed as the aircraft made its presence known. Colonel Rayburn smiled slightly. "The Commandant thought you might appreciate a proper Marine Corps entrance when you leave town, Gunny. That bird is here to take you wherever you'd like to go today." The bikers had gathered near Crash, watching the proceedings with undisguised awe. Ricky caught Harold's eye and offered a thumbs up, his expression reflecting the sentiment that seemed to be spreading through the crowd, that they were witnessing something historic, something larger than their small town had ever experienced. "Where would you like to go, sir?" Colonel Rayburn asked. Harold looked at Jamie, then at the assembled veterans, bikers, and townspeople. For 50 years, he had carried the burden of Firebase Cottonwood alone. Now, suddenly, that burden was being acknowledged, shared, honored. "Home," Harold said simply. "I'd like to go home." The Marine helicopter landed in the clearing near Harold's cabin, its powerful rotors bending the surrounding pines. Harold sat on his porch, watching as Jamie conferred with the Marines who had accompanied them from town. The media had been denied access to his property, thanks to Chief Sanders' deputies and the bikers who continued their self-appointed guard duty at the access road. "They'll return tomorrow to finalize the Washington arrangements," Jamie explained, climbing the porch steps after the Marines had departed. "Colonel Rayburn is coordinating directly with the White House." Harold nodded, still processing the day's events. The Marines' unexpected appearance had elevated what was already a surreal experience. 50 years of anonymity shattered in 24 hours. "Coffee?" Harold offered, gesturing toward the door. Jamie smiled slightly. "Still take it black?" "Only way to drink it," Harold confirmed, a fragment of their old connection surfacing. Inside the cabin, Jamie looked around with quiet assessment. He hadn't been there since helping his father move in after Catherine's death. The space was spare, but meticulously maintained. Military corners, on the bed visible through the bedroom door, books arranged by subject and author on the shelves, dishes immediately washed and put away. "Place looks good," Jamie commented, accepting the mug Harold handed him. "You've kept it up," Harold shrugged. "Not much else to do out here." They sat at the small kitchen table, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. 8 years stretched between them like a minefield, each unsure where it was safe to step. Jamie spoke first. "I should have called. Before all this." "Yes," Harold agreed simply. "You should have." Another silence, shorter this time. Jamie studied his father's face, the deep lines around his eyes, the military straight posture, despite the pain that must accompany his injuries and age. "I was angry," Jamie admitted, "after Mom died. You shutting everyone out, moving way out here?" "I know," Harold acknowledged. "Your mother was always the glue. Without her." He trailed off, the familiar ache of Catherine's absence still sharp after all these years. "Peterson found me first," Jamie said, changing direction. 3 years ago. Said he'd been looking for you since the 70s. He sipped his coffee. "Once I heard his story, I couldn't let it go. The medal you deserved, the recognition that was denied." Harold's expression remained neutral. "Never needed recognition." Maybe not, Jamie conceded. But the truth needed to come out. About Firebase Cottonwood. About what really happened. A knock at the door interrupted them. Harold raised an eyebrow at his son. Probably Major Collins, Jamie suggested. Or one of the deputies. But when Harold opened the door, he found Crash standing there, alone. The biker looked uncharacteristically nervous, his usual bravado was absent. "Mr. Winters," Crash began, "sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to check if you needed anything." Harold studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." Crash entered, nodding respectfully to Jamie, who had risen from his chair. "Captain," he acknowledged. "You're the biker who's been helping my father?" Jamie asked, extending his hand. "I appreciate it." Crash shook the offered hand, visibly surprised by the warm reception. "Least we could do, especially after—" He glanced uncomfortably at Harold. "After you harassed him at the gas station," Jamie finished, his tone neutral. Rather than accusatory, Crash nodded, accepting the characterization without defense. "Yes, sir. Not our finest moment." Harold gestured to an empty chair. "Coffee?" "No, thank you, sir. I won't stay long." Crash remained standing as if at informal attention. "Just wanted to let you know the guys and I talked it over. If you're still considering our offer to escort you to Washington, we've made some arrangements." Harold raised an eyebrow. "What kind of arrangements?" "Proper escort protocol," Crash explained. "Ricky's uncle was in the Patriot Guard Riders. He's going to train us on formal motorcycle escort procedures for veterans, and we've ordered special vests for the ride, with your unit insignia, if that's okay." The thoughtfulness of the gesture clearly caught Harold off guard. "That's not necessary." "With respect, sir, it is," Crash insisted. "What happened yesterday at the gas station, it's not who we want to be." He hesitated, then continued with evident difficulty. "My father served. I never gave him the respect he deserved. Can't change that now, but maybe I can do better with you." Jamie watched the exchange with interest, seeing a side of his father's situation he hadn't considered. How this sudden recognition was affecting not just Harold, but the community around him. "The offer is appreciated," Harold said carefully. Crash nodded, accepting the non-committal response. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small object, holding it out to Harold. "Found this at a surplus store in Grayson. Thought you might want it." Harold accepted the item. A Marine Corps gunnery sergeant insignia, slightly tarnished, but intact. The 3 chevrons and 3 rockers that had once adorned his uniform. "Been a while since I wore these," Harold said quietly. "The Marines today." "Got me thinking," Crash explained. "All those medals and ribbons on their uniforms. Figured maybe you'd want something of your own until the ceremony." The simple gesture seemed to affect Harold more than the official Marine's visit. He closed his hand around the insignia, the metal warm against his palm. "Thank you," he said. The words genuine. Crash nodded once, then turned to Jamie. "Captain, your father saved my life yesterday." Jamie looked confused. "How so?" "Made me see something I've been avoiding for 15 years. Crash's normally gruff voice softened. "After I leave here, I'm calling my son in Oregon. Long overdue. Understanding passed between the men. The recognition of how easily relationships could be severed, how difficult they were to repair, and how precious the opportunity to do so truly was." "Good luck," Jamie offered sincerely. Crash turned back to Harold. "Sir, whatever you decide about the Washington trip, the Iron Disciples are at your service. We'll be at the end of your road until the media circus dies down." After Crash departed, Jamie returned to the kitchen table, watching as his father carefully placed the gunnery sergeant insignia on the mantel, beside the photograph of his unit. "Unexpected allies," Jamie observed. Harold nodded. "Life is full of them if you pay attention." The weight of their 8-year estrangement hung in the air between them, the parallel to Crash's situation unmistakable. Jamie took a deep breath, venturing into territory they had both been avoiding. "Dad, about what happened after Mom's funeral?" The White House East Room gleamed under crystal chandeliers, the afternoon sun streaming through tall windows. Rows of chairs had been arranged to accommodate the assembled guests, high-ranking military officers, government officials, members of Congress, and the families of those being honored. Harold sat in the front row, unaccustomed to the dress blues that had been specially tailored for him. The uniform felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, a connection to the young Marine he had been and the old warrior he had become. Beside him, Jamie sat ramrod straight in his own dress uniform, the oak leaves of a major newly pinned to his shoulders, a promotion that had come through just days before. "Nervous?" Jamie asked quietly, as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Harold shook his head. "I've been through worse." Jamie smiled at the understatement. "Colonel Peterson arrived. He's been looking for you." Harold nodded, his expression betraying little of the emotion that accompanied the name. After 50 years, he would finally reunite with the lieutenant whose life he had saved, the man who had spent decades searching for him. Behind them sat a contingent that drew curious glances from the Washington elite, 10 members of the Iron Disciples Motorcycle Club, each wearing a black vest emblazoned with Harold's 1st Marine Division insignia. They had escorted his motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base to the White House, a striking honor guard that had caught the attention of the press. Crash, seated directly behind Harold, leaned forward slightly. "Hanging in there, Gunny?" he asked, using the respectful military shorthand for Harold's rank. "Affirmative," Harold replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. The journey to this moment had been surreal. 3 weeks of media attention, of reporters camped at the end of his road, of requests for interviews he consistently declined. Through it all, the unlikely alliance had held, the bikers maintaining their watch, Chief Sanders enforcing Harold's privacy, and Jamie managing the logistics of what had become a national story. A door opened at the far end of the East Room, and a military aide appeared. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the President of the United States." The assembled guests stood as the President entered, accompanied by the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Harold rose with military precision despite the pain in his legs, refusing the walker that had been positioned nearby. The ceremony began with the traditional formalities, the playing of the national anthem, the invocation by a military chaplain, brief remarks from the Secretary of Defense about the nature of heroism and sacrifice. Then, Colonel David Peterson was escorted to the podium. At 73, he moved with the assistance of a cane, his right leg still bearing the evidence of that night at Firebase Cottonwood. He surveyed the room until his gaze found Harold, and for a moment the two men locked eyes across half a century of separation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Peterson began, his voice strong despite his age, "I am here today because of the man we honor. On May 12, 1971, I was a young lieutenant with a mangled leg in the middle of enemy territory. Gunnery Sergeant Harold Winters could have left me. Many would have. Instead, he carried me through hell." Peterson's account of that night brought Firebase Cottonwood to life for the assembled guests. The desperate defense, the overwhelming odds, the courage that had allowed a handful of Marines to hold out against an enemy force 10 times their size. What the official reports couldn't say then, but what we can acknowledge now, is that Gunnery Sergeant Winters also prevented a devastating intelligence breach that would have endangered hundreds of American lives, Peterson continued. At great personal risk, he secured enemy intelligence and prevented its use against our forces. As Peterson spoke, Harold remained at attention, his expression stoic. Only Jamie, seated beside him, could see the subtle tension in his father's jaw, the only outward sign of the emotions stirring beneath the surface. For 50 years, bureaucracy and politics denied this hero the recognition he deserved, Peterson concluded. Today, we finally correct that injustice. The President approached the podium, thanking Peterson before turning to address the room. Heroism comes in many forms, the President began. Sometimes it's a split-second decision that changes everything. Sometimes it's the quiet dedication to duty that saves lives without fanfare or recognition. Gunnery Sergeant Harold Winters exemplified both. The formal citation was read aloud, the official account of Harold's actions at Firebase Cottonwood, now fully declassified and acknowledged for the first time in 5 decades. Gunnery Sergeant Winters, please step forward, the President requested. Harold moved with measured steps to the designated position. Jamie watched his father with pride, seeing in the older man's bearing the same unwavering strength that had defined him throughout Jamie's childhood. The President lifted the Medal of Honor, the 5-pointed star suspended from a light blue ribbon, and placed it around Harold's neck. The official photographer captured the moment as the two men shook hands. "The nation thanks you for your service and your sacrifice, Gunnery Sergeant," the President said, loud enough for the attendees to hear. Harold nodded once, accepting the words with characteristic reserve. Then it was Harold's turn to speak. He approached the podium with the same deliberate cadence that had carried him through enemy territory 50 years earlier, each step measured and purposeful. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. Those who had witnessed his reluctance at the Millfield Town Hall expected similar brevity now. Instead, Harold withdrew a folded paper from his pocket and smoothed it carefully on the podium. "I stand here today not for myself," he began, his voice steady, "but for the men who cannot be here. Lieutenant Michael Cooper, Corporal Manuel Rodriguez, Private First Class William Jenkins, Private Thomas Rivera." He paused, the names hanging in the air like a prayer. "They gave everything at Firebase Cottonwood. I merely came home with their memory." Harold looked up from his notes, his gaze finding Jamie in the front row, then moving to Colonel Peterson, and finally settling on Crash and the Iron Disciples seated respectfully in their unlikely place of honor. "This medal belongs to them," Harold continued, "to the fallen, to the families who received folded flags instead of their loved ones, to every Marine who ever stood a post in a forgotten corner of a foreign land." The simplicity and sincerity of his words resonated through the ornate room, a stark contrast to the formal speeches that had preceded his remarks. 50 years is a long time, Harold concluded, long enough to forget many things, but we must never forget the cost of war, or those who paid the highest price. "Thank you." As Harold stepped away from the podium, the room erupted in applause. Colonel Peterson rose to his feet first, tears streaming openly down his face. The Marines present followed, rendering sharp salutes to their brother-in-arms. Soon, the entire assembly was standing, offering the recognition that had been 5 decades delayed. Through it all, Harold maintained his composure, the Medal of Honor gleaming against his uniform. At last, a visible symbol of the invisible burden he had carried for half a century. 1 month later, the Millfield Veterans Memorial Park had existed for decades as little more than a small stone marker and flagpole near the town hall. Now it had been transformed. New benches circled a freshly installed granite monument, and flowering shrubs added color to the previously neglected space. Harold sat on one of these benches, watching as townspeople gathered for the dedication ceremony. The media frenzy had finally subsided, allowing him to resume something resembling his normal routine, albeit with one significant change. The isolation he had cultivated for 15 years had been irrevocably broken. "All set, Dad?" Jamie asked, approaching from the parking area. He had extended his leave to help his father navigate the aftermath of the Medal of Honor ceremony, their relationship healing through shared purpose rather than forced conversations. Harold nodded, rising to his feet. His walker remained folded beside the bench, not needed today. The silver-headed cane that had once belonged to Catherine's father served him instead, a connection to the wife who had loved him through his darkest days. Mayor Wilson bustled over, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Winters, perfect timing. We're about to begin." The crowd that assembled exceeded Millfield's usual turnout for civic events. Veterans from surrounding communities had arrived, many wearing caps or jackets identifying their service. The local school had dismissed early, allowing students to attend what their principal had deemed a living history lesson. Most surprising to Harold was the contingent of motorcycles parked in a neat row along Main Street. The Iron Disciples had established themselves as unofficial guardians of veterans' affairs in Millfield, following their involvement with Harold. What had begun as an apology had evolved into a mission. Crash approached, extending his hand to Harold. The biker looked different, his beard trimmed, his leather vest now bearing patches for the Patriot Guard riders alongside the Iron Disciples insignia. Good turnout, Crash observed, surveying the crowd. Harold nodded. Unexpected? Not really. Crash disagreed with a slight smile. Town needed something like this, someone like you. Before Harold could dismiss the comment, Chief Sanders called for everyone's attention. The dedication ceremony began with the presentation of colors by a Marine Corps Honor Guard, specially dispatched from Quantico, a courtesy arranged by Jamie. Mayor Wilson spoke briefly about the importance of remembering service and sacrifice, then introduced the guest of honor. Harold made his way to the podium, the Medal of Honor conspicuously absent from his attire. He had worn it only once since the White House ceremony, when he had finally visited the graves of Cooper, Rodriguez, and Jenkins at Arlington National Cemetery. This memorial, Harold began, gesturing to the granite monument behind him, isn't about me. It's about all of us who served, those who returned, and those who didn't. The simple granite obelisk bore no names, only the emblems of each military branch and the words, "In honor of those who served, Millfield remembers, communities." Forget sometimes, Harold continued, not out of disrespect, but because life moves forward. We who served understand that better than most. Moving forward is necessary. His gaze found Ricky in the crowd, standing beside an older woman who must be his mother. The young biker had spent hours over the past month listening to Harold's carefully shared stories about Vietnam. Not the combat, but the men, the brotherhood, the moments of humanity amid inhumanity. But remembering is necessary too, Harold added, not just the wars or the battles, but the people, the ones who left pieces of themselves overseas so that the rest of us could come home whole. As Harold spoke, Jamie watched his father with quiet pride. The walls Harold had built around himself after Catherine's death were gradually lowering, not demolished in a single cathartic moment, but dismantled brick by brick through new connections and renewed relationships. This park is Millfield's. Promise to remember, Harold concluded. I'm honored to have played a small part in making that happen. The applause was warm and genuine as Harold returned to his seat. The remainder of the ceremony proceeded with appropriate solemnity. The laying of a wreath, the playing of taps, the formal acceptance of the memorial by the town council. Afterward, Harold found himself surrounded by well-wishers and fellow veterans. He engaged with each one briefly but sincerely, no longer withdrawing from the connection as he once might have. "How are you holding up?" Jamie asked during a momentary lull. Harold considered the question. "Better than expected," Jamie nodded, understanding all that remained unspoken. "I need to head back to base tomorrow." "I know," Harold acknowledged. "But I was thinking," Jamie continued carefully, "maybe you could visit next month, meet your granddaughters properly. Sarah's been asking about you since she saw you on TV." The invitation hung between them, not the first Jamie had extended over the years, but the first since their reconciliation. "I'd like that," Harold said simply. Across the park, Crash was speaking with a group of young veterans recently returned from overseas deployments. His animated gestures suggested he was extending an invitation of his own, likely to the motorcycle club's new veteran outreach program. The transformation was remarkable, from harassment at a gas station to committed advocacy in just 1 month. Harold understood the power of purpose, of having something to stand for beyond oneself. Chief Sanders approached, extending his hand. "Fine ceremony, Mr. Winters." "Harold," he corrected. "After all this, I think we can use first names, Chief." "Frank," the police chief offered, with a smile. "You've changed this town, you know." Harold shook his head. "The town changed itself, just needed a reminder of what was important." As the crowd began to disperse, Harold noticed a familiar truck pulling into the parking area. David Peterson emerged, assisted by his son. The two men had spoken several times since the White House ceremony, each conversation bridging more of the 50-year gap in their shared history. "Didn't expect to see you here," Harold greeted him. "Genuine pleasure." In his voice, Peterson smiled. "Wouldn't miss it. Besides, I have news." He handed Harold an envelope bearing official Marine Corps seals. "The Historical Division has completed their review. Cooper, Rodriguez, and Jenkins are being awarded Silver Stars posthumously. The families will receive them next month." Harold accepted the envelope, emotion briefly crossing his weathered features. "They deserved more. They got more," Peterson said gently. "They had you remembering them all these years, carrying their story until it could finally be told." As the afternoon sun began its descent, Harold found himself on his porch once again, the familiar solitude now a choice rather than a necessity. Jamie sat beside him, their coffee mugs steaming in the cooling air. "Will you be all right out here alone?" Jamie asked, the question careful rather than demanding. Harold looked out over the property that had been his refuge for 15 years. "Not really alone anymore," he observed. "Not sure that's a bad thing." In the distance, a motorcycle engine rumbled, likely one of the Iron Disciples making their regular check of the access road, a habit they had maintained even after the media departed. The sound no longer signaled trouble to Harold, but rather an unexpected alliance, a reminder that community could form in the most unlikely circumstances. "Mom would be proud," Jamie said quietly. "Of both of us, I think." Harold nodded, allowing himself to imagine Catherine's reaction to the events of the past month. She had always believed in connections, in the healing power of community. Perhaps she had been right all along. The Medal of Honor rested in its case on Harold's mantel beside the photograph of his unit from Vietnam. He had placed it there not for display, but as a reminder, not of his own actions, but of the men who had been there with him. Cooper, Rodriguez, Jenkins, Rivera, and countless others whose sacrifices had too often gone unmarked. Until now. Now they were remembered. Now their story had been told. And Harold Winters, who had carried the weight of Firebase Cottonwood for 50 years, could finally set down that burden and breathe.